Hey team, my name is Shelly, and your city is probably racist. Today we're talking about restrictive covenants. First, let's talk about what covenants are. Covenants are requirements in a property deed that say what you are and aren't allowed to do with a piece of property. Restrictive covenants limit a piece of property to certain uses. There are all kinds of restrictive covenants. If you live in a neighborhood with a homeowners association, you probably have restrictive covenants in your deed related to things like what color you can paint in your house or if you can build a shed in your backyard. But let's talk specifically about racially restrictive covenants. Racially restrictive covenants are covenants in a property deed that say that somebody can't buy that piece of property based on their race. In my last video, I talked about how governments used racially explicit exclusionary zoning to promote racial segregation, but how that was deemed unconstitutional in 1917. But the difference between that and racially restrictive covenants is that covenants are dealt with by private entities, not by governments, and that makes them harder to regulate. In 1926, there was a Supreme Court case that challenged the constitutionality of racially restrictive covenants. The Supreme Court ultimately decided that they were allowable, leading to a huge wave of restrictive covenants based on race being used all across the country. By 1940, 80% of homes in Los Angeles and Chicago had racially restrictive covenants written into their property deeds. Some cities were even given awards for their heavy-handed use of racially restrictive covenants. Here's an example of one of those covenants from a home in Seattle. No person of any race other than the white race shall use or occupy any building or lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants as a different race domiciled with an owner or tenant. It wasn't until 1948 that the Supreme Court struck down the enforceability of racially restrictive covenants, citing the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment. But it wasn't until the Federal Fair Housing Act in 1968 that they were deemed illegal outright. Even though they were deemed unenforceable in 1948, think about how many homes were built between 1926 and 1948. How many neighborhoods were developed. And here's the thing with covenants. They run with the land, meaning that their contractuality exists from property owner to property owner. And you might be surprised to learn that a lot of these racially restrictive covenants, even though they're illegal and unenforceable, still exist in deeds for homes all across the country. That example I shared earlier from Seattle, still in the property deed. There have been efforts to remove these racially restrictive covenants from property deeds, but it's difficult and costly. Evan McKenzie, a political science professor at the University of Illinois, said, "While the covenants are there is still room for people to think that although it cannot be legally enforced, it is nonetheless a promise that they are morally obligated to keep. And that's an argument, in my view, for removing them." Others argue that they shouldn't be removed, but should be kept as a reminder of the dark history of 20th century American segregation. In his book, The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein says that homeowners who have racially restrictive covenants written into their deeds should have this language included. "We, your name, owners of the property at your address, acknowledge that this deed includes an unenforceable, unlawful, and morally repugnant clause excluding African Americans from this neighborhood. We repudiate this clause, are ashamed for our country that many once considered it acceptable, and state that we welcome with enthusiasm and without reservation neighbors of all races and ethnicities." Racially restrictive covenants didn't start segregation, nor did their being outlawed end segregation. But they were yet another tool that galvanized racism in American cities. My name is Shelly, and your city is probably racist.